Brussels, 1943. In a narrow street where cobblestones still bore the scars of tank treads, there stood a building that the SS officers knew well. The establishment had no sign, no grand entrance, just a red lamp that glowed every evening like a forbidden secret in the heart of occupied Belgium. Inside, champagne flowed, German laughter echoed off velvet walls, and a woman named Andrée de Jongh ran what appeared to be just another brothel servicing the Third Reich's elite. But beneath the silk sheets and perfume, beneath the floorboards where jackboots stomped in drunken revelry, lay a network of hidden compartments that housed Allied pilots shot down over Europe. These men, trembling and bleeding, pressed their faces against cold wood, while mere inches above them, SS officers undressed and boasted about their latest kills. The distance between discovery and survival was the thickness of a mattress, and the woman orchestrating this impossible dance of deception was about to become one of the most unlikely heroes the Allies never publicly celebrated. Andrée had not planned to become a savior of downed airmen. Before the Wehrmacht rolled into Brussels in May of 1940, she ran a legitimate guest house, a respectable establishment where traveling salesmen and minor officials rested their heads. Her father had been a schoolteacher, her mother a seamstress, and Andrée herself had dreamed of studying medicine before the economic collapse of the 30s forced her into hospitality work. She was 31 years old when the Germans arrived, unmarried, sharp-tongued, and possessed of a survival instinct that would soon evolve into something far more dangerous. The occupation transformed everything. Within months, the Gestapo began cataloguing every business, every resident, every potential asset or threat. Andrée watched as neighbors disappeared in the night, as Jewish families were rounded up, as the city she loved became a garrison town filled with field-grey uniforms and the constant threat of arbitrary violence. It was during this suffocating new reality that a German officer named Hauptmann Klaus Weber approached her with a proposition that would change the trajectory of her war. Weber was not seeking information or demanding compliance through threats. He was a pragmatist who understood that soldiers far from home needed certain comforts, and that establishments providing those comforts could be very profitable under the right management. He suggested that Andrée convert her guest house into a more specialized venue, one that catered exclusively to German officers seeking discretion and pleasure. The alternative, he made clear without saying it directly, was requisition of her property and possible relocation to a labor camp. Andrée accepted, but not for the reasons Weber imagined. She understood immediately that a brothel frequented by high-ranking Nazis would be the last place the Gestapo would search for resistance activity. It would become invisible through its very function, protected by the shame and secrecy of its clientele. Within weeks, she had recruited 4 women, all of them facing their own desperate circumstances under occupation, and opened for business. The red lamp was lit for the first time in August of 1940, and the Germans came eagerly, never suspecting that the woman serving them drinks and managing their entertainment was already making contact with the Belgian resistance. The resistance cell that approached Andrée 3 months later was part of the Comet Line, a network dedicated to smuggling downed Allied airmen out of occupied Europe and back to England. The Nazis were shooting down British and American bombers with increasing frequency, and crew members who survived the crashes faced a grim choice: surrender and spend the war in a prisoner camp, or attempt escape through hostile territory with help from underground networks. The Comet Line needed safe houses, places where these hunted men could hide for days or weeks while false papers were prepared and escape routes planned. They needed locations that were beyond suspicion, and a brothel filled with drunk SS officers qualified as exactly that. The woman who made the initial approach was a school nurse named Marie, who had known Andrée before the war. She arrived one afternoon carrying a medical bag and a desperate request. A British pilot named Robert Havisham had been shot down near Leuven, had broken his leg in the crash, and was currently hiding in a barn where German search parties were growing closer every hour. Marie needed a place no one would think to look, and she needed it immediately. Andrée said yes without hesitation, though the decision would define and endanger every day of her life for the next 2 years. That same night, Robert Havisham was smuggled into the brothel through a cold delivery entrance, his leg badly set and his face grey with pain. Andrée had already prepared one of the upstairs rooms, moving a heavy wardrobe to reveal a false panel that led to a space between walls, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down. This crawlspace had been built during the First World War for hiding valuables from German requisitions, and now it would hide something far more precious and dangerous. Robert was pushed into this suffocating darkness just as a staff car pulled up outside, carrying 3 SS officers seeking an evening of entertainment. The men climbed the stairs, chose their companions, and retired to rooms where champagne and laughter masked the sound of a British pilot breathing through clenched teeth less than 3 feet away, separated only by plaster and wallpaper, and Andrée's absolute refusal to let fear show on her face. The first night established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the following months. German officers would arrive, sometimes staying until dawn, completely unaware that enemy combatants were hidden in the infrastructure of their pleasure. Andrée developed systems, signals, and backup plans. She learned which officers drank heavily and could be trusted to pass out, which ones were suspicious and needed constant distraction, and which rooms offered the best acoustic cover for any accidental sounds from the hidden men. She learned to hide medical supplies in hat boxes, to disguise the smell of antiseptic with cheap perfume, and to forge paperwork that would explain any unusual activity if questioned. But most importantly, she learned to compartmentalize her terror into a locked box somewhere in her chest, bringing it out only in the brief hours after midnight when the officers had left and she could check on the men she was hiding, men who whispered thanks in English accents while she changed their bandages and promised them that England was closer than they thought, that survival was possible, that this nightmare would end. The system worked flawlessly for exactly 17 days before the first real test arrived, in the form of Sturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel. Vogel was not like the other officers who frequented the establishment, men who came to forget the war and lose themselves in temporary pleasures. He was a counterintelligence specialist assigned to root out resistance networks in Brussels, a man whose reputation for methodical cruelty had spread through the underground like a contagion. When he walked through the door on a freezing November evening in 1940, Andrée felt her blood turn to ice. He did not smile, did not drink the champagne offered to him, and spent the first 20 minutes simply observing the room with eyes that seemed to calculate the weight and worth of every object and person. He had come, he explained in precise French, because he had heard this establishment maintained exceptional discretion, and discretion was something he valued highly in his line of work. What he did not say, but Andrée understood immediately, was that he was testing the brothel for security, determining whether it could be trusted for meetings with informants and collaborators. That same night, hidden in the false wall of the room directly above where Vogel sat reviewing papers and sipping mineral water, was an American bomber pilot named James Corrigan. Corrigan had been shot down 4 days earlier during a raid on a Luftwaffe airfield, had walked 30 kilometers through occupied territory with a shattered collarbone, and was running a fever that made him delirious. Andrée had given him morphine from her rapidly dwindling medical supplies, but the drug made him unpredictable. Earlier that evening, before Vogel's arrival, Corrigan had started mumbling in his sleep, fragments of English mixed with fever dreams about burning aircraft and falling through clouds. Marie had been there helping change his bandages when the mumbling started and both women had frozen, listening to the dangerous sounds emerging from behind the wall. They had managed to wake him gently, to press cool cloths against his burning forehead and convince him to stay silent, but the incident revealed a terrifying truth. They had no real control over what the hidden men might do in moments of unconsciousness or pain. Vogel stayed for 3 hours that first night, conducting what appeared to be an interview with a Belgian businessman who clearly wanted to discuss something he could not say in public. Andrée kept the champagne flowing to other guests, maintained the atmosphere of careless indulgence, and prayed that Corrigan's fever would not spike again. Every creak of the floorboards above sounded like thunder. Every laugh from the other rooms felt too loud or too soft. She found herself watching Vogel's face for any sign that he heard something unusual, any flicker of suspicion that would end with Gestapo agents tearing apart the walls. But Vogel seemed satisfied with whatever transpired in his meeting, and when he left just after midnight, he informed Andrée that he would be returning regularly, that he found the atmosphere conducive to confidential discussions. This was exactly the kind of official patronage that would protect the brothel from random searches and requisitions, but it also meant that the most dangerous man in Brussels counterintelligence would now be a regular presence in a building actively hiding Allied personnel. The morning after Vogel's first visit, Andrée met with 3 members of the Comet Line leadership in a bakery basement to discuss whether they should shut down the operation. The risk had multiplied exponentially. If Vogel ever discovered what was happening literally above and below his confidential meetings, the entire network would collapse. Dozens of resistance members would be tortured for information, and the escape line that had already saved 47 Allied airmen would be destroyed. One of the leaders, a former army captain named Philippe, argued that they should move the operation to a different location immediately. But Andrée understood something the others did not. Moving now, suddenly closing or changing the nature of the establishment right after Vogel had chosen it for his base of operations would itself trigger suspicion. The only way forward was to continue, to be even more careful, and to turn Vogel's presence into an advantage. After all, what Gestapo agent would think to search a building where their own counterintelligence officer conducted secret business? The decision was made to continue, but with enhanced precautions. A new hiding space was constructed in the basement, accessible through a false wine rack, large enough to hold up to 4 men if necessary. A local doctor sympathetic to the resistance agreed to make house calls disguised as medical inspections of the working girls, allowing him to treat hidden airmen without suspicion. Most importantly, Andrée began keeping detailed mental notes of Vogel's schedule, his patterns, his moods, learning to read him the way a sailor reads weather. She discovered he always arrived on Wednesday and Saturday evenings, always stayed between 2 and 4 hours, and always left alone. These patterns became sacred knowledge, the framework around which all other activities were planned. On nights when Vogel was present, no new airmen were moved in or out. On nights when he was absent, the operation accelerated. The brothel had become a stage where 2 completely different dramas played simultaneously, separated by inches of wood and plaster, and one woman's absolute determination that neither performance would ever acknowledge the existence of the other. By the spring of 1941, Andrée had perfected what she privately called the choreography of survival. The establishment now functioned on 2 completely separate operational levels that never intersected except in her own exhausted mind. On the surface level, German officers arrived in staff cars, were greeted with champagne and carefully maintained French charm, and departed hours later with their secrets intact and their needs satisfied. Below this performance, in spaces that defied architectural logic, Allied airmen recovered from injuries, studied forged identity papers, and waited for the signal that their journey to Spain and freedom could continue. Andrée moved between these worlds with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to split her consciousness into separate locked rooms. When she smiled at an SS captain and complimented his French pronunciation, the part of her brain that knew 3 British pilots were hidden 15 feet away simply did not exist. This psychological compartmentalization was not a choice, but a survival mechanism, the only way to prevent the constant terror from showing on her face. The spring also brought an escalation in Luftwaffe effectiveness against Allied bombing raids, which meant more downed aircraft and more desperate men seeking shelter. The Comet Line was now routing an average of 6 airmen per month through Andrée's establishment, staying anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks depending on their physical condition and the availability of safe transport to the next link in the chain. This volume created logistical nightmares that would have challenged a military quartermaster. Food had to be acquired without raising suspicions about why a brothel serving 6 people needed provisions for 12. Medical supplies had to be stolen, traded or purchased on black markets, where Gestapo informants lurked behind every transaction. Clothing had to be obtained that would allow airmen to pass as Belgian workers during their eventual transport, which meant finding items that fit men who were often significantly taller than the average Belgian and whose military posture betrayed their origins even in civilian dress. The most dangerous challenge was not logistics, but sound. The building's architecture worked against secrecy in ways that became apparent only through near disasters. Floorboards creaked under weight they had not been designed to conceal. Water pipes transmitted vibrations from hidden rooms into areas where German officers relaxed and listened. Coughs, sneezes, even the sound of someone turning over in a cramped hiding space could potentially carry into the wrong ears. Andrée developed an arsenal of acoustic countermeasures. She kept a gramophone playing constantly on the ground floor, cycling through the same collection of French jazz and German military marches that her clientele expected. She arranged for construction work on an adjacent building that provided convenient cover noise during daylight hours. She even trained the women working with her to time their movements, their conversations, and their carefully staged theatrical sounds of pleasure to mask any accidental noise from the hidden spaces. The entire building became an instrument played with desperate precision, every sound calculated and controlled. But human beings are not predictable instruments, and the men hiding in those suffocating spaces were dealing with trauma that made silence almost impossible. Some had watched their crew members die in flames. Others had landed in occupied territory and spent days evading German patrols, sleeping in ditches and surviving on raw vegetables stolen from fields. Many arrived with injuries that had been inadequately treated, infections spreading through their bodies, pain that made unconscious cries inevitable. Andrée became expert at recognizing the signs of impending breakdown. She could see it in the way a pilot's eyes would start focusing on nothing, the way his hands would begin to shake, the way his breathing would become shallow and rapid. When she saw these signs, she would personally sit with the man, sometimes for hours, speaking in a low voice about anything except the war, describing Brussels before the occupation, recounting childhood memories of her father's classroom, painting verbal pictures of a world that still existed somewhere beyond the nightmare they currently inhabited. One such crisis occurred on a Saturday evening when Vogel was in the building conducting one of his confidential meetings. A Canadian pilot named Thomas Brennan, hidden in the basement space behind the wine rack, began experiencing a panic attack triggered by the sound of German voices directly above him. His breathing became labored, gasping, the kind of sound that would carry through the old building's thin floors. Andrée was upstairs serving drinks when one of the women, a tough former factory worker named Simone, appeared at the door with a specific hand signal they had developed. The signal meant immediate crisis below. Andrée excused herself, claiming she needed to check on wine inventory, and descended to the basement where she found Brennan hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror, his body shaking uncontrollably. She had perhaps 2 minutes before his gasps became loud enough to penetrate upstairs. Without hesitation, she covered his mouth with her hand, not violently but firmly, and pressed her forehead against his, forcing eye contact. She whispered in English, a language she had learned specifically for these moments, telling him that he was safe, that the sound he heard was protection, not danger, that his crew needed him to survive this moment. She stayed there, hand over his mouth, forehead pressed to his, until his breathing slowed and the panic subsided back into manageable fear. When she finally returned upstairs 12 minutes later, Vogel had not even noticed her absence. The summer of 1941 brought a heat wave that transformed the hidden spaces into suffocating ovens and nearly collapsed the entire operation. The false walls and crawl spaces had no ventilation beyond tiny gaps in the original construction, and temperatures inside these compartments climbed to levels that made consciousness itself a struggle. Men who had survived being shot down over enemy territory, who had walked dozens of kilometers through occupied Belgium with broken bones and shrapnel wounds, now faced the possibility of dying from heat stroke while hiding from their enemies. Andrée attempted every solution her desperate mind could conceive. She installed small battery-powered fans that provided minimal air circulation but created a humming sound that had to be masked by keeping the gramophone volume higher than usual. She distributed wet cloths that the hidden men could drape over their faces, though the moisture evaporated within minutes in the oppressive heat. She even convinced a sympathetic plumber to create a system of hidden pipes that could deliver small amounts of cool water from the basement, disguising the work as routine maintenance that the German authorities would not question. But the heat created problems beyond physical discomfort. It made the airmen irritable, prone to arguments among themselves that had to be conducted in whispers, their tempers fraying under conditions that would have broken most men within days. One evening in July, two British pilots hidden in the same crawl space began a heated disagreement about whose responsibility it had been to destroy their aircraft's code books before evacuating. The argument escalated from whispers to normal speaking volume, their English voices carrying through the walls into a hallway where a German naval officer was walking toward one of the bedrooms. Andrée heard the voices, recognized the danger instantly, and made a split-second decision that probably saved 6 lives. She intercepted the German officer, stumbled deliberately as if she had drunk too much champagne, and fell against him with enough force that he had to catch her. While he steadied her with annoyed German efficiency, she laughed loudly, apologized in slurred French, and began singing a popular cabaret song at a volume that drowned out the English voices. The officer, convinced she was simply drunk and unprofessional, continued to his room while Andrée maintained her theatrical performance until she was certain the argument behind the walls had stopped. The incident prompted a new rule that Andrée enforced with absolute authority. Any airman who could not maintain perfect silence would be moved to a more remote safe house, regardless of his physical condition or the risk involved in transport. This was not cruelty but mathematics. One man's inability to control himself could result in the torture and execution of dozens. The Comet Line leadership supported her decision, and within days, 2 pilots who showed signs of psychological instability were relocated to a farmhouse 30 kilometers outside Brussels. Both men protested, believing they were being punished, not understanding that Andrée was actually trying to save them from themselves. The woman who ran that farmhouse later reported that one of the pilots had indeed broken down completely within a week, screaming about burning aircraft in the middle of the night. If that breakdown had occurred in the brothel, with German officers sleeping in adjacent rooms, the entire resistance network would have been destroyed. The psychological toll on Andrée herself was becoming visible to those who knew her before the war. Marie, the nurse who had first approached her about hiding airmen, noticed that Andrée had lost nearly 15 pounds, that her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching, and that she had developed a habit of checking and rechecking locks on doors, even when she knew they were already secure. This was not paranoia, but hypervigilance born from the mathematical certainty that a single mistake would result in death for everyone she was trying to protect. She slept no more than 3 or 4 hours per night, always in a chair rather than a bed, always dressed and ready to respond to whatever crisis might emerge. Her dreams, when they came, were not about being discovered by the Gestapo, but about failing the men she was hiding, about hearing them call for help while she stood paralyzed and unable to move. Yet, despite the mounting stress, despite the heat and the near disasters, and the constant presence of Vogel conducting his counterintelligence meetings directly above hidden Allied personnel, the operation continued with remarkable success. By August of 1941, 32 airmen had passed through the establishment and successfully reached Spain. 32 men who would have spent the war in German prison camps or been executed as spies were instead back in England, flying missions, telling debriefing officers about the incredible Belgian network that had saved them. Some of them mentioned a brothel in Brussels, where a woman risked everything to hide them, but these reports were classified and filed away, the details considered too sensitive to share even within Allied intelligence communities. Andrée de Jongh was saving lives at a rate that rivaled military operations, but her name appeared in no official records, no commendations, no recognition beyond the whispered gratitude of men who understood that the woman serving drinks to SS officers was the bravest person they had ever encountered. October of 1941 marked the arrival of what Andrée would later describe as the longest 72 hours of the war. A British Lancaster bomber had been shot down during a night raid over Antwerp, and 4 crew members had survived the crash. This was not unusual. What made this situation catastrophic was that all 4 men were injured seriously enough that they could not be immediately moved to the next safe house in the chain. One had a compound fracture in his leg that required surgical intervention. Another had severe burns across his back and arms. The third was concussed and vomiting intermittently. The fourth, the pilot, had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was showing signs of internal bleeding. The Comet Line leadership informed Andrée that she would need to hide all 4 men simultaneously for at least 3 days while the sympathetic doctor worked to stabilize them, and while arrangements were made for a truck that could transport them without detection. 3 days meant 6 nights of German officers in the building, including 2 scheduled visits from Vogel. The establishment's hiding spaces had never been designed to conceal 4 men at once, especially not 4 men who required constant medical attention. Andrée made the decision to use every available concealment simultaneously. 2 men in the crawl space behind the false wall, 1 in the basement behind the wine rack, and 1 in a newly constructed space beneath the floorboards of a storage room that was rarely accessed. This distribution meant that if discovery came, it would likely expose only 1 man rather than the entire group. But it also meant that Andrée and her small team had to maintain awareness of 4 separate locations while performing their usual roles. The doctor arrived disguised as a health inspector, conducting mandatory examinations of the working girls, a cover that allowed him to spend several hours in the building without suspicion. He worked on each injured man in sequence, setting the broken leg with makeshift splints, debriding the burns and applying sulfur powder that Andrée had obtained through black market contacts at enormous cost, treating the concussion with rest and careful monitoring, and most critically, determining that the pilot's internal injuries were serious but not immediately fatal if he remained still and received basic wound care. The first night passed without incident, though Andrée barely breathed when a drunken Wehrmacht captain stumbled through the hallway directly above where 2 of the airmen lay hidden. The second night brought Vogel, who arrived with 2 other SS officers for what appeared to be a planning session regarding a crackdown on resistance cells in the surrounding countryside. They spread maps across a table in the main parlor, drinking coffee rather than alcohol, speaking in low voices about raids and arrests and interrogation techniques. Andrée served them with her usual practiced charm, while her mind calculated the distances between their conversation and the hidden men. The pilot with internal injuries was directly below them, perhaps 4 meters down, lying on a mattress that had been carefully padded to prevent any sound from movement. The burns victim was in the crawl space to the east, close enough that if he cried out from pain, the sound might carry. Every minute of that 3-hour meeting felt like an hour, every pause in the German conversation like a moment when discovery hung in the balance. But the real crisis came on the 3rd night, during what should have been the final evening before transport arrived. A new German officer appeared without warning, a Gestapo investigator named Rolf Steiner, who claimed he was following up on reports of black market activity in the neighborhood. This was standard procedure, the kind of random inspection that happened throughout occupied Brussels, but the timing was catastrophic. Steiner demanded to search the entire building, including areas that guests did not normally access. He had brought 2 soldiers with him, both armed, both looking eager to find something incriminating. Andrée's heart rate climbed to a level where she could hear her own pulse in her ears, but her face remained perfectly calm. She explained that such a search would disturb her guests, including Sturmbannführer Vogel, who was currently in a private meeting upstairs. The mention of Vogel's name and rank made Steiner pause. He had not known that a senior SS counterintelligence officer used this establishment. The social calculation was immediate. If he proceeded with an aggressive search and found nothing, he would have embarrassed a superior officer. If he proceeded and found something, he would be a hero. But the risk of angering Vogel over nothing was significant. Steiner made his decision based on bureaucratic self-preservation rather than investigative thoroughness. He would conduct a limited search of the public areas only, a cursory inspection that would satisfy his paperwork requirements without risking offense to powerful men. He walked through the ground floor, opened a few cabinets, glanced into the storage room where 1 airman lay beneath floorboards less than 2 feet from Steiner's boots, and declared himself satisfied that nothing suspicious was occurring. The entire inspection lasted 12 minutes. When he left, Andrée remained composed until the staff car pulled away. Then she locked the front door, walked calmly to her private room, and vomited into a basin from pure released tension. She had just witnessed how thin the margin of survival truly was, how a single bureaucratic decision, made for career reasons rather than investigative ones, had prevented a massacre. The 4 airmen were transported out the following night, in a vegetable delivery truck, all of them surviving their injuries and eventually returning to England. None of them ever learned how close they had come to discovery, how a Gestapo investigator's boots had stood inches from their hiding place, how one woman's reputation and one SS officer's regular presence had created a shield of assumed legitimacy that even the secret police were reluctant to penetrate. The winter of 1941 brought snow to Brussels and a new kind of danger that Andrée had not anticipated. The cold was so severe that the building's ancient heating system struggled to maintain even minimal warmth, which meant that the hidden spaces became life-threatening environments for men who could not move to generate body heat. Frostbite became as serious a concern as discovery. Andrée began smuggling extra blankets into the hiding spaces, carefully selecting dark colors that would not show through cracks if light happened to penetrate the false walls. She also started a practice of bringing hot water bottles wrapped in cloth, items that could provide warmth for several hours without creating suspicious sounds. But the cold created another problem that nearly proved fatal: condensation. When warm breath met frigid air in the unheated crawl spaces, moisture formed and dripped, creating stains on walls and ceilings that could reveal the existence of spaces where no spaces should be. Andrée spent hours with rags and paint, touching up suspicious marks before they could be noticed by observant German eyes. But winter also brought a shift in Vogel's behavior that initially terrified Andrée before revealing itself as an unexpected advantage. The Sturmbannführer began arriving more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times per week, rather than his previous predictable schedule. His meetings grew longer, his mood darker, and his alcohol consumption increased dramatically. Andrée eventually learned through careful conversation that Vogel was under pressure from his superiors in Berlin. The resistance networks he had been assigned to destroy were actually growing more effective, and his failure to produce results was threatening his career and possibly his life. The man who had seemed invincible now sat in her establishment drinking himself into angry stupors, complaining in slurred German about Belgian stubbornness and the impossibility of rooting out resistance cells that enjoyed popular support. His deterioration should have made him more dangerous, more likely to lash out with random searches and arrests. Instead, it made him more dependent on the brothel as a refuge where he could temporarily escape his failures. This dependency created space for Andrée to operate with slightly less fear of his presence. A man drinking heavily and focused on his own career troubles was a man paying less attention to his surroundings. She began timing the movement of airmen to coincide with Vogel's longest drinking sessions, moments when his awareness was compromised enough that small sounds or brief shadows would not register as threats. This was incredibly risky, essentially hiding men while their primary hunter sat one floor above in a self-medicated fog, but it was also the kind of calculated risk that the operation required. The Comet Line was now moving nearly 10 airmen per month through the establishment, and the only way to maintain that volume was to exploit every possible advantage, including the psychological breakdown of the very man assigned to destroy them. February of 1942 brought the incident that Andrée had always known would eventually come, a direct confrontation between her role as protector and her role as collaborator. An American pilot named David Morrison had been hidden in the basement for 4 days, waiting for transport papers that were delayed by a Gestapo crackdown in Ghent. Morrison was young, barely 20 years old, and his face still held the softness of someone who had been trained for war, but not yet fully hardened by it. On his 4th evening in hiding, Vogel arrived in a particularly dark mood, drunk before he even entered the building, and demanded that Andrée personally accompany him upstairs. This was unusual. Vogel typically kept their interactions professional, almost businesslike. But tonight he wanted something more than just the use of a room. He wanted company, conversation, perhaps validation that he was not the failure his superiors claimed he was becoming. Andrée understood immediately that refusing would create suspicion, but accepting meant leaving Morrison unguarded in the basement while the women working with her managed the other guests. She made the decision to comply, climbing the stairs to Vogel's preferred room, while her mind calculated every possible disaster that could occur in her absence. For 2 hours, she sat across from the Sturmbannführer while he drank cognac and talked about his childhood in Bavaria, about his early career hunting communists in Munich, about his growing certainty that the war was entering a phase where victory was no longer certain. He spoke about his doubts in German, assuming she understood less than she did, and Andrée listened with an expression of sympathetic attention while her hands gripped her knees under the table to stop them from shaking. She was sitting across from a man who would personally torture her to death if he knew the truth, listening to him confess vulnerabilities and fears, performing emotional labor for someone who represented everything she was fighting against. When he finally fell asleep in his chair just after midnight, Andrée left the room with legs that barely supported her weight and descended to the basement to find Morrison exactly where she had left him, alive and undiscovered. She sat on the cold floor next to his hiding space and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of silent crying before washing her face and returning to work. Spring of 1942 arrived with a catastrophe that nearly ended everything. The Gestapo arrested Philippe, the former army captain who served as one of the Comet Line's primary coordinators. He was taken during a routine identity check that revealed forged papers, and within hours, he was in the basement of Gestapo headquarters, being interrogated with methods designed to extract every piece of information he possessed. Philippe knew everything: safe house locations, courier routes, the names of dozens of resistance members, and most dangerously, he knew about the brothel and Andrée's role in the network. The Comet Line leadership sent an emergency message through Marie. Andrée had perhaps 24 hours before Philippe's silence broke under torture, and she needed to evacuate immediately, burn all evidence, and disappear into the general population of occupied Belgium. But evacuating meant abandoning 3 British airmen currently hidden in the building, men who were not yet healthy enough to be moved, and who would certainly be discovered if the establishment was suddenly abandoned or raided. Andrée made a decision that defied every survival instinct and every order from the resistance leadership. She would not evacuate. She would not abandon the men she was protecting. Instead, she would bet everything on a single assumption: that Philippe would die under interrogation before revealing her identity. This was not faith in his strength, but calculation based on what she knew about Gestapo methods. They would start with physical torture, escalate to psychological techniques, and eventually reach a point where Philippe would talk. But that process typically took 3 to 5 days before prisoners broke completely. If she could move the 3 airmen out within 48 hours, if she could create enough plausible deniability about the establishment's activities, if she could present a surface that appeared completely innocent when the Gestapo eventually came, there was a small chance of survival. It was perhaps a 10% chance, maybe less, but it was better than the 0% chance that the hidden airmen would have if she fled. She spent the next 36 hours in a state of controlled panic that she would later barely remember. The 3 airmen were given morphine to keep them sedated and quiet, then moved under cover of darkness to a backup location that had been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency: a sealed compartment beneath a false floor in the coal cellar, accessible only by removing specific stones in a specific sequence. Food, water, and a bucket for waste were placed inside. The space was barely large enough for 3 men lying down, with no light and almost no air circulation, but it was the most secure location in the building because it required knowledge of the exact entry method to even discover it existed. Meanwhile, Andrée began systematically removing any evidence of the operation. Forged documents were burned. Medical supplies were distributed to the women with instructions to hide them in their personal belongings. Extra food stores were given to neighbors with explanations about over-purchasing. The establishment was transformed back into exactly what it appeared to be: a brothel serving German officers. The Gestapo arrived 41 hours after Philippe's arrest. 6 agents in leather coats, led by an investigator named Hans Kruger, who was known throughout Brussels for his efficiency in breaking resistance networks. They came without warning at 7 in the morning, before the establishment was open for business, and they brought engineers with equipment designed to detect hidden spaces. This was not a cursory inspection like the one Steiner had conducted. This was a systematic destruction of the building in search of anything that did not belong. They tore apart rooms, removed panels from walls, crawled through the attic and basement, measured floor heights against ceiling heights to look for discrepancies. Andrée watched with outward calm while internally calculating whether the coal cellar's hidden compartment would survive this level of scrutiny. The engineers spent particular attention on the basement, tapping walls and floors, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate concealment. They passed directly over the stone floor that hid 3 British airmen less than 2 meters below. But the construction was old enough and solid enough that their instruments detected nothing suspicious. After 4 hours of searching, Kruger called Andrée into the main parlor for interrogation. He did not sit her down or offer any pretense of courtesy. He stood close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath and told her that Philippe had mentioned a brothel before dying under interrogation, that he had suggested this establishment might be involved in resistance activities. Andrée felt her throat tighten at the confirmation that Philippe was dead, but she forced her expression to show only confusion. She explained that many German officers used the establishment, including Sturmbannführer Vogel, and that suggesting she would jeopardize such valuable patronage by involvement with the resistance was absurd. She pointed out that Vogel himself could verify her loyalty and discretion. The mention of Vogel's name created the exact reaction she had hoped for. Kruger's certainty wavered. He had not known that an SS counterintelligence officer was a regular client. If he arrested Andrée and she turned out to be innocent, he would have disrupted Vogel's operations and potentially made an enemy of a dangerous man. The social and political calculations that had saved her before saved her again. Kruger left with a warning that she was now under observation, that any suspicious activity would result in immediate arrest, but he left without discovering the 3 men breathing shallow breaths in absolute darkness 2 meters beneath where he had been standing. The 3 airmen remained sealed in the coal cellar for 6 days, while Gestapo surveillance teams watched the establishment from unmarked vehicles parked across the street. 6 days in absolute darkness with minimal food and water, breathing air that grew more stale with each hour, lying in their own waste because the bucket had overflowed by day 3. When Andrée finally judged it safe enough to extract them, 2 of the men could barely walk and the 3rd had developed a fever from infection. They were moved that same night to a farmhouse outside the city, transported in a hearse as supposed corpses, a method so audacious that the Gestapo surveillance team never considered it worth investigating. All 3 men eventually reached England, but one of them would later tell debriefing officers that the 6 days sealed beneath Brussels were worse than being shot down, worse than evading German patrols, worse than anything else he had experienced in the war. He described it as being buried alive, while listening to boots walking overhead, knowing that rescue might never come, that the woman who had hidden them might have been arrested or killed, that they might suffocate in darkness and never be found. The Gestapo surveillance lasted for 3 weeks, before Kruger apparently decided that Andrée was not worth the resources required for continued observation. The establishment returned to normal operations, but normal had fundamentally changed. The close call with Philippe's arrest and the subsequent raid had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. The Comet Line leadership made the difficult decision to significantly reduce the volume of airmen routed through the brothel, dropping from 10 per month to perhaps 3 or 4, only in cases where no other safe house was available. This reduction was strategically necessary but emotionally devastating for Andrée, who understood that every airman not hidden in her establishment was an airman at greater risk elsewhere, potentially in locations that were less secure or less practiced in the deadly choreography of concealment. She had spent nearly 2 years perfecting this operation, had developed instincts and systems that saved lives with remarkable consistency, and now those capabilities were being deliberately underutilized because the risk had become too great. But the reduced volume created space for Andrée to become involved in other aspects of resistance work that had previously been impossible due to her constant presence being required at the brothel. She began serving as a courier, carrying messages and forged documents between different cells, using her status as a known collaborator to move through checkpoints with minimal scrutiny. German soldiers who might search a schoolteacher or a factory worker rarely bothered with thorough inspections of a woman they recognized as someone who entertained their officers. This invisible privilege of assumed corruption became a tool as valuable as the hidden spaces in her building. She carried microfilm hidden in lipstick tubes, memorized codes disguised as recipes, and transported weapons components sewn into the lining of fashionable coats that German guards complimented, rather than searched. Her role in the resistance expanded from hiding airmen to facilitating the entire network's communication infrastructure. Summer of 1942 brought news that fundamentally changed the nature of the war and the resistance. The Allied invasion of North Africa suggested that the tide might be turning, that Germany's expansion had reached its limit, that liberation was now a possibility rather than a fantasy. This news energized the resistance networks throughout Belgium, but it also made the Germans more paranoid and more brutal. Reprisal executions increased. Collective punishments became standard practice. The margin for error, already microscopic, shrank to nothing. Andrée watched as neighbors were shot for infractions as minor as listening to BBC broadcasts. She attended mandatory public hangings designed to terrorize the population into submission. She saw the bodies of resistance members left hanging in public squares as warnings, some of them people she had worked with, people who had trusted her with their lives and their secrets. The war was entering a phase where survival required not just courage and cleverness, but also a kind of luck that could not be manufactured or planned for. It was during this period of escalating violence that Vogel's visits became less frequent and then stopped entirely. Andrée learned through careful inquiries that he had been reassigned to the Eastern Front, essentially a demotion disguised as a transfer, punishment for his continued failure to destroy the Belgian resistance networks. His replacement was a younger officer named Stefan Richter, who showed no interest in the brothel or its discreet services. The loss of Vogel's protective presence left the establishment more vulnerable to random inspections and Gestapo attention. What had once been an advantage, the regular presence of a senior SS officer, was now simply gone, and Andrée had to rebuild the perception of legitimacy from scratch. She cultivated relationships with Wehrmacht logistics officers who appreciated the establishment's discretion and reliability. She made sure that enough minor officials had personal reasons to want the brothel to continue operating unmolested. She built a new web of protection based not on one man's patronage, but on many men's vested interest in maintaining a place where they could temporarily forget the war. It was exhausting work, a constant performance of charm and calculated availability, and it was absolutely necessary for survival. The beginning of the end came in January of 1943 with the arrival of a Canadian pilot named Michael Thornton. He had been shot down during a daylight raid over Brussels itself, his bomber exploding in mid-air with such violence that witnesses thought no one could have survived. But Thornton had been blown clear of the wreckage, had deployed his parachute at the last possible moment, and had landed in a residential neighborhood where sympathetic Belgians immediately hid him before German search parties could respond. He was brought to Andrée's establishment with burns covering 30% of his body, both legs broken, and a psychological state that the Comet Line courier described as fragile. The doctor who examined him said that moving him again within 2 weeks would likely kill him, that his injuries required constant medical attention, and that his mental state made him a significant security risk. Andrée accepted him anyway, because refusal meant sending him to a less secure location, where his chances of survival were even lower. Thornton's presence coincided with the worst possible timing, a new Gestapo operation, specifically targeting resistance safe houses. Kruger had not forgotten about the brothel, had apparently spent months building a case based on surveillance and informant reports, and now had authorization for a much more aggressive investigation. He returned with a full team and a warrant that allowed unlimited search duration. This time they brought dogs trained to detect human scent in hidden spaces, equipment that Andrée had not prepared for, because such technology had not been used in previous raids. The dogs immediately became agitated in the basement, barking at the coal cellar floor where Thornton lay hidden in the sealed compartment. Kruger ordered his men to begin removing the stone floor piece by piece, a process that would inevitably reveal the hidden space within hours. Andrée watched the systematic destruction and understood that she was witnessing the end of everything she had built, that Thornton would be discovered, that she would be arrested and likely executed, that the entire network would be compromised by whatever information the Gestapo could extract from her. But salvation came from the most unexpected source. One of the Wehrmacht logistics officers that Andrée had cultivated, a captain named Ernst Weber, who was not related to the original Hauptmann Weber, but who appreciated the establishment's services, happened to arrive for a scheduled appointment just as the dogs were indicating the coal cellar. Weber was furious at finding his evening interrupted by a Gestapo operation, and more importantly, he outranked Kruger in the complex hierarchy of occupied Brussels. He demanded to know by what authority the Gestapo was disrupting an establishment that served senior Wehrmacht officers, suggested that Kruger's obsession with this particular location was becoming a nuisance to military morale, and threatened to file a complaint with the regional commander. The confrontation escalated into a turf war between Wehrmacht and SS, the kind of bureaucratic conflict that plagued German occupation everywhere. Kruger was forced to choose between continuing his investigation and creating an enemy within the Wehrmacht command structure. He chose to withdraw, but not before placing the establishment under formal notice that any future suspicious activity would result in immediate closure and arrest of all personnel. The dog's indication of the coal cellar was explained away as residual scent from coal workers, and the stone floor was left partially dismantled but not fully excavated. After the Gestapo departed, Andrée waited 4 hours to ensure they were truly gone before opening the hidden compartment to find Thornton barely conscious. Having heard the entire confrontation through the stones, convinced he was about to be discovered and determined to take cyanide, rather than risk compromising the network under torture. She talked him down from that decision, got him water and morphine, and began planning his immediate evacuation regardless of his medical condition. He was moved 2 days later to a monastery outside Bruges, transported by sympathetic clergy who could move through checkpoints with religious privileges that civilians did not possess. The incident with Thornton marked the effective end of the Brothel's role as a primary safe house. The Comet Line leadership made the final decision that the location had become too compromised, too well known to the Gestapo, too dependent on bureaucratic luck rather than actual security. Andrée was reassigned to full-time courier work and coordination of other safe houses, her expertise now deployed across the network rather than concentrated in one location. The establishment continued to operate as an actual brothel, still serving German officers, still maintaining its cover, but no longer hiding Allied airmen beneath its floorboards. In the 28 months that it had functioned as a resistance safe house, the brothel had sheltered 68 Allied airmen, all but 2 of whom successfully reached England. Those 2 had been captured during transport to the next link in the chain, far from Brussels, and had died in German prisoner camps without revealing how they had survived in occupied Belgium. 66 men owed their lives to a woman whose name appeared in no official records, whose heroism was indistinguishable from collaboration to anyone who did not know the truth, whose courage was measured not in battlefield glory, but in the ability to smile at SS officers while hiding their enemies beneath her feet. Andrée de Jongh survived the war, but only barely. In August of 1943, she was finally betrayed by an informant who had infiltrated a different cell of the Comet Line and had observed her courier activities. She was arrested, interrogated for 6 weeks in conditions designed to break her completely, and eventually sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she spent the remainder of the war doing forced labor that nearly killed her. She never revealed the location of the safe houses she had operated, never gave the Gestapo a single name that could compromise the network. When British forces liberated Ravensbrück in April of 1945, Andrée weighed less than 90 pounds and was suffering from tuberculosis and malnutrition. She returned to Brussels to find her establishment had been destroyed in the final months of fighting, the building reduced to rubble that buried all evidence of the hidden spaces where so many men had found salvation. The women who had worked with her had scattered, some dead, some disappeared into new identities, their collaboration now a source of shame rather than secret pride. The Allied governments eventually recognized Andrée's contributions, though the recognition came years after the war ended and was delivered quietly, almost apologetically, as if heroism performed in a brothel was somehow less legitimate than heroism performed on a battlefield. She received medals from Britain, the United States, and Belgium, ceremonies attended by officials who had never risked anything comparable to what she had endured. Some of the 66 airmen she had saved attended these ceremonies, middle-aged men now who remembered the woman, who had hidden them while entertaining their enemies, who had risked torture and death so that they could return home. They tried to express gratitude that transcended language, tried to explain to journalists and historians what it had meant to lie in darkness, listening to SS officers laughing above them, knowing that their survival depended entirely on one woman's absolute refusal to show fear. But the full truth of what happened in that Brussels brothel between 1940 and 1943 remained classified for decades, buried in intelligence files that governments considered too sensitive for public knowledge. The idea that a woman running a brothel could be a resistance hero complicated narratives about wartime virtue that post-war societies wanted to maintain. It was easier to celebrate nurses and factory workers, women whose heroism fit comfortable categories, than to acknowledge that some of the bravest acts of the war occurred in spaces society preferred to pretend did not exist. Andrée died in 1997 at the age of 87, having lived more than 5 decades beyond the war that defined her. In her final interviews, she never expressed regret about the choices she made, never apologized for the establishment she ran or the men she entertained as cover for the men she was saving. She understood something that history has been slow to accept, that heroism does not require respectability, that courage can exist in any circumstance, and that the most effective resistance sometimes happens in places where no one thinks to look, performed by people no one expects to be heroes, hidden in plain sight beneath the feet of those who would destroy them if they only knew where to search.